2, clear takeoff, left hand. Takeoff left, this is speed 1. Left land, swim west, copy. Speed 1. Crossing 2-1. Crossing at 2-4 is runway.
Hello and welcome to the Blueskies Podcast. I'm PR Ganapathy, your host.
Just 70, roger, report type southeast, connection, speed 4, midway, and field selected.
We have a very interesting guest with us today, Wing Commander Vinayak Davray. Wing Commander Davray was commissioned into the Indian Air Force in 1963 as a navigator and flew for many years, almost 18 years, in various aircraft, particularly the Canberra. And after his leaving the Air Force, he had an instrumental role to play in the Director Generals of Civil Aviation at many different countries and served in the ICAO as an accident investigator. So he's had just a wealth of experience in the field of aviation. So today we're going to speak to him about his experiences and career, first in the Air Force and then outside the Air Force in civil aviation. Welcome to the program, sir. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us today.
Thank you very much, Ganapathy, and I'm delighted to be on this podcast.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So if we start off with all our guests by asking them about their background, where they grew up. What was the motivation to join the Air Force? Did you have somebody in your family? Was it something you saw? What got you to join the Air Force?
Yeah, interesting question. I had a bit longish background on the motivation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Swatantraveer Savarkar,
Yes, sir.
Vinayak Davray Savarkar, was instrumental in motivating the Indian youth to join the armed forces.
Uh-huh.
That was pre-independence.
Right.
And my grandfather worked with Savarkar
Mm-hmm.
in that campaign of motivating youth
Right.
to enter into armed forces.
Uh-huh.
And as a result, my uncle, that is my grandfather's younger son,
Mm-hmm.
he joined British Indian Army
Uh-huh.
and became captain and fought in the World War II.
Wow.
And subsequently, that legacy carried on. And two of my brothers and myself, we were motivated on the same lines. I joined the Air Force. My younger brother joined the Army, and youngest joined the Navy.
Oh, fascinating. That's wonderful.
That's our history and the motivation.
Uh-huh.
Incidentally, when I was selected for the Air Force,
Mhm.
Savarkar was alive,
Ah,
although my grandfather wasn't alive.
right.
And Savarkar came to Pune to our house to bless me before I was embarked on a journey to Jodhpur.
Fascinating.
So that is another great occasion in my life
Right.
where I received the blessings from such a great personality.
Wonderful. Wonderful to hear that.
And in those days, there was this graduate entry
Mm-hmm.
through which I entered the Air Force. And as I mentioned, that my training started at Air Force Flying College in Jodhpur, because Flying College was in Jodhpur in those days.
Right. Uh-huh. And what was that training like? So how long was the course and what sorts of subjects did you learn? And
Yes, training was initially at basic and advanced, basic and intermediate stages in Jodhpur.
Mhm.
And advanced and applied stages were in Begumpet Transport Training Wing.
Uh-huh. Right.
Incidentally, I had joined the 83rd Pilots course to start with.
Okay. Uh-huh.
And during my basic stage of HT2, the instructors felt that not only myself, there are 4 of my other colleagues as well,
Mhm.
are better cut out to be navigators.
Okay. Uh-huh.
I don't know what made them think that,
Mhm.
but then they recommended to the commandant there
Mm.
that 5 of us from that 83rd course should be sent for navigation training.
Uh-huh.
And that's how we landed up in the navigation training.
Okay.
Of course, it was fascinating.
Mm.
And Jodhpur Airport, most of the buildings were built at the time of the Maharaja of Jodhpur.
Right.
And in fact, one of the Maharaja's palaces was the officers' mess.
Mhm, yeah.
And the cadets' mess was, of course, specially built.
Right.
And entire airport was with the academy or with the flying college.
Mhm.
And we had fascinating 1 year there in which these two stages were there.
Mhm.
I spent nearly a year and a half there
Mhm.
because of my first year term as a pilot training,
Mm.
and thereafter 2 terms for navigation training.
Right.
That was early 1961.
Mhm.
And thereafter, all of us moved to Begumpet for transport training wing. And the fighters team used to go to Hakimpet.
Right. And what aircraft did they have there, sir?
Vampires were there in Hakimpet for pilots training.
Right.
And Dakotas were there for the navigation as well as pilots training.
Right.
The transport pilots training.
Okay. Mhm.
And the transport pilots and navigators training were almost together.
Mm.
They used to use the term dovetailed.
Mhm.
So that camaraderie actually was very much there.
Fascinating.
Not only that,
Mm.
we used to meet our Hakimpet colleagues virtually once a week.
Aha.
And either they used to come down to Begumpet or we used to go down to Hakimpet.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of interaction among all the colleagues of the same course.
Right.
And it was a huge batch in the sense total pilots trainees were something like 70. And navigators were 35.
Wow. Okay.
So it was fairly large batch. And all of us passed out on the 22nd of June 1963.
Right.
And there was a big parade at Begumpet Airport. General Sri Nagesh was the governor of then United Andhra Pradesh, was the reviewing officer.
What was the syllabus or the training like? So what sorts of things did you learn on the ground? What sort of exercises did you do in the air?
Syllabus was mainly divided into 3 types of subjects. One is aircraft related, other was navigation related, and the third was allied subjects. Allied subjects like meteorology, the aviation medicine, etc. Coming back to the aircraft related subject, the aero engines, airframes was an independent subject, and virtually these syllabi were common for pilots as well as navigators.
Okay.
Principles of flight normally used to be taught by one of the flying instructors. And navigation related subjects mainly the maps and projections, dead reckoning navigation, radio navigation aids, magnetism and compasses, and aircraft instruments. So virtually each of the subjects was subdivided into the related parts. And not only that, they used to teach us the advanced subjects like the aids which are likely to come up. For example, you'd be surprised, we were taught about the inertial navigation when none of the Indian Air Force aircraft were equipped with inertial navigation as a future aid, because theoretically it was in the offing in those days. So that is how the subjects, the ground subjects were divided. Actually, the entire merit list was combination of all these.
And, if you can just give me a flavor for the state of the art as far as navigation was concerned, did you have VORs by that time, or was there only NDBs on the ground?
Yes, we had the VORs by then. NDBs were, of course, the basic aids. But on Dakota type of aircraft, we didn't have anything more than VOR. Some training Dakotas were equipped with air position indicators. Now, air position indicator gives the position of the airplane. It's a sort of computer which works out your forward movement of the aeroplane using only the heading, so without wind. So you will get a position without wind.
Ah.
So after a while, the position what you get on API or air position indicator would be minus the wind.
Ah.
So if you apply the wind to that, then you'll get the actual ground position of the aircraft. So we used to consider that as a very modern aid because there are no other advanced aid than that.
Right. Was there ILS in those days or no ILS at all?
Yes, ILSs were there, but again, ILS is only at the airport.
Major airports.
And not all airports were equipped. And it was only once you reach in the vicinity of the airport, then you could use the ILS.
Okay.
But for long distance navigation, you could not use ILS, but of course VORs were there.
VORs were there.
But VORs range again, at that height where Dakotas were operating was not longer than 150 to 175 nautical miles.
Right.
However, the major flying used to be done from VOR to VOR. As a result, that you had number of VOR stations and you could go away from a VOR station using VOR at back of you.
Right.
And thereafter, once you get into the range of next VOR,
you switch over.
You use that VOR for your next navigation. So they used to call VOR to VOR. But that was a luxury only on major routes like Bombay to Delhi.
Right.
Madras to Delhi. But not on other routes. And most of our exercises were on the other routes.
Right.
Therefore, we couldn't use that VOR to VOR technique.
Right.
We had to literally do mainly by DR navigation or dead reckoning.
Right.
And another thing which could fall back upon was the map reading. That was a basic art of reading the ground with the help of maps.
Right.
And as we move on further, I'll talk more about this map reading and especially night map reading and particularly dark night map reading.
Right. I was just going to come to that.
I'll give you a little more insight on that.
Yes.
Perhaps somebody else must have told you about that. But that comes a little later. Here we were mainly initiated into normal day navigation and then night navigation as well. And also another important subject for navigation was astronavigation.
Right.
Wherein astronomy was also taught to us, including that of spherical trigonometry. So some people were finding it hard to even cope up with normal trigonometry. So the moment they heard about spherical trigonometry, they were taken aback. Where are we going? Are we really going to use that? But subsequently, we realized that there is ample amount of astronavigation used in the spacecrafts. Even nowadays, even presently, because once you are in the space, there is nothing else you have other than astro or the astronomical bodies.
Right.
And that was one of the very fascinating subject because it was a new subject to most of us. And our instructors were very competent and they really initiated us. It was a very, very interesting nights when they taught us about the star recognition, etc.
Wow.
And then sextant type of equipment which we used to use it for taking sights was also introduced to us. And each one of us used to carry a sextant, quite heavy though.
My God.
But it was a sort of prized possession of the navigators. Most of us really enjoyed doing this astronavigation.
Right.
I mean, going through taking sight, it used to take about a minute to take a sight of a star. And single sight of a star would not help you.
Yeah.
You got to take at least 3 sights of 3 different stars, which would give you a fix.
Right.
An ideal fix is 60-degree angle of cut. So you have to choose the stars which are going to give you 60-degree angle of cut.
Wow.
So 1 minute each for each site. Then site reduction is the calculation using various tables and calculations. So normally we used to do that practice during our leisure time of site reduction, and each site reduction used to take as long as 10 minutes.
My goodness.
So
wow.
taking a fix, 3 minutes of site taking and 10 minutes for each side for reduction.
Wow.
That means at least half an hour you struggle to make one fix.
My God.
And when we discussed that with our instructor, you know what he told us? He said, "Oh, you are lucky. You can get a fix in half an hour's time." Naval guys have to take one fix in the morning and one fix in the evening on the ships. So they have ample time, and they are the ones who initiated us into this astronavigation.
Right.
And they virtually take their own time to reduce the sight, and each fix, if they make it in 1 hour, they feel themselves very lucky. So you are better off in doing it half an hour's time.
Right. Sir, I'm just full of questions, so I have to stop you. On the ground itself, taking a fix on a star sounds like a really difficult thing. In the air, in a vibrating aircraft, where do you get? Did you have a little canopy of some sort through which you could take these sights? And how difficult was it, especially in turbulence? How would you do that?
Yeah, I'll answer that. Most of the aircraft which have navigators normally have a perfect dome through which you can take sights.
Okay.
Like Dakota has a dome on top. Packets have a dome on top. AN-12s have a dome. Virtually every aircraft, because it was a legacy of Second World War.
Correct.
In the Second World War, of course, as it came from the naval ships to the air or to the aeroplanes. And aeroplanes in the Second World War all of them were equipped with navigators and many other crew members. So they had these domes designed through which you could take sight.
Okay.
Secondly, this taking 60 seconds was mainly to overcome all the turbulence and averaging out the sight. Otherwise, you could take sight in a matter of fraction of a second.
Right.
What is the angle? What is the sight? Sight is nothing but your angle of elevation of the star in relation to the horizon.
Right. How do you determine the horizontal, sir? Is it a spirit level or something like that?
Yes, the sextant had actually it's called bubble sextant.
Wow.
So in that there was a bubble which used to define the horizontal. And their marathon effort was to keep that bubble in the center because it had two axes and there is a cross, and you have to struggle to keep the bubble in the center in spite of all the turbulence and other moments.
My God.
And 60 seconds were given because each second a sight was taken and they would be averaged out. Therefore, all those errors will be cancelled out. So what you get at the end of 60 seconds or 1 minute, that is an average angle of elevation within that 1 minute. So you used to take mean time, that is at half of that 1 minute. And there was a provision to take half a minute sight as well. So you could reduce the time if there was no turbulence, very smooth weather, etc. You could take 30 seconds sight. You don't have to wait for 1 minute. So have I answered that question of yours?
Yeah, so the first question, you've got your sighting. Now, how do you do the calculations? Do you have a table or a station that was given to you? And were you using slide rules at that time? Because I presume there were no calculators, no computers.
Yeah, that's correct. The Dalton computer of navigation has a provision to use that was all in one. So you could use Dalton's computer for doing the calculations. Okay. And most of the calculations were actually additions and subtractions. Because what you do worked out actually, to give you a little bit insight of this astronavigation. You see, Earth is moving around its own axis. At the same time, Earth moves around the sun or rotates around the sun. So what happens is, Earth has a specific speed to move around its own axis. That is 360 degrees in 24 hours. Right. If you reduce that, you will find hourly movement of Earth is 15 degrees. And meridians go from pole to pole. They are great circles on the Earth. So if you extend those meridians to the infinity, then they are called celestial meridians. Right. Otherwise, the same meridians are on the Earth as well, not actually drawn, but imaginary meridians. Right. And any body will be at given time will be on some meridian.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And what you do is when you measure the angle of elevation of that body, then you got to compare that with the latitude and longitude of the aircraft. And that comparison and angle of elevation is subsequently compared with that of the meridian on which that body is there and meridian on which the aircraft is there.
Right.
So difference between the two meridians, one on the meridian of the body and other is meridian of the aircraft, is called hour angle. Hour angle is just a name given to it, basically because it all boils down to 15 degrees per hour, the movement of the earth around itself. And these calculations of each body's hour angle is done periodically. Periodically means for every 4 months, an almanac is published and the hour angles are calculated for the bodies which are suitably placed for observations.
Right.
In that, the bright stars and bright planets are used, nothing else. Because we can see the bright star to take the site or the bright planets. Which are the bright planets? Like Venus, which is the brightest planet. And there are few bright stars known as Rigel, Kent, and few others. And planets being closer to Earth, they move or change their hour angle faster than the stars. Therefore, normally people used to prefer the planets because they're easily available and easily recognizable. Like nobody can miss out Venus. Nobody can miss out Mars. Mars gives an appearance of a brownish planet or brownish body. Moon moves fastest being closest to the Earth, and you could take moon side as well. So the popular site used to be the brightest planets, moon, and few of the bright stars. And the brightest star is the Sirius, which is a southern hemisphere star actually. So it is not available in the temperate latitudes. It is available in our latitude, all right. But many a times it's very close to horizon. Now for this type of observations, you prefer a body which is between 30 and 60 degrees of angle of elevation. If some body is very close to horizon, you normally don't take that, you discard that. And another trick is you look at the almanac, see which of the bodies are there and pick up the bodies because they are well placed for the observations. And from almanac, you get the approximate position of that body as well in relation to the aircraft. So you have the approximate position and you take a site. And finally, what you do in the reduction, you find the distance of that star or if you put a plumb point from that star or a body on the Earth, at that time when you are taking a site, it will land somewhere on the Earth. And how much is the distance and angle from that point to the aircraft? And that's what you work out by calculations. But you can't find that point which is maybe thousands of miles away. Therefore, what you do, the angle of that star, which is called azimuth, which is like a bearing in relation to the true north. The azimuth of that body is measured and which is plotted on the chart using the direction of that body, nothing else. So you have a direction of that body, an imaginary point on the map, which is not too far from your aircraft position. So from there, plotting a bearing is not very difficult. So what you actually do when you plot that, you plot the azimuth from an imaginary point, which is towards the direction of the plumb point. And that is not your position. The position is always at right angles from that. And next thing what you calculate is how much is the intercept between that imaginary point and your aircraft. And that intercept, because imaginary point is selected within about 60 nautical miles of the aircraft, so that bearing line does not go beyond 60 miles. And what you draw is actually azimuth and a line right angles to it. And that is defined as your position line. And what is the definition of position line? A position line is a line at which The aircraft is supposed to be at any given time.
Right.
And you have 3 position lines, and that gives you a fix.
Wow.
So that's a longer way of calculating.
Amazing.
Incidentally, subsequent advancement in the astro, or the which presently spacecrafts are using, they have something known as gyroscopic sextants. So what question you asked about defining the horizontal, where do you find a horizontal in space?
Right.
So you don't use horizontal, but you use a plane or a reference plane.
Some reference plane.
And that reference plane is defined by the gyroscope.
Right, perfect.
So that is a further innovation of the astronavigation. And you have automatic sextants, which are taking automatic sextants are taking sights in matter of 10 seconds. And within about 30 seconds, you have a fix.
Fascinating.
So that is the modern astronavigation. In those days, we had to struggle with the calculations.
Amazing.
Visual before graduate. Just need 70, Roger, report time southeast, connection for the midway, and deal selected.
Now, sir, in a multi-crew environment, what are you communicating to the pilot? You're just giving them a heading to steer for a certain period of time?
Yeah, that's right. Mostly it is a heading to steer, speed to follow, and smaller aircraft didn't have much variation of the speeds, but speed to follow and direction.
Right.
And thereafter, you work out your further positions. I mean, you carry on fixing your positions virtually. The rule used to be every half an hour minimum.
Okay.
And normally in this transport aircraft, flights used to be about 3 to 4 hours. Sometimes the type of aircraft I flew were as long as 8 hours. So every half an hour position, whichever means you have, electronic means or any other means, and go on finding progress. Cross-check your positions by visual observations or radio fixes, which are much more reliable than others, and then arrive at your final destination. Keep on revising your estimated time of arrival at your destination. And if you're doing a specific timing run, that means you got to adjust your speed to reach a specific target on given time.
Correct.
So you may be running late or running fast. So you got to adjust your speed.
Right.
So depending upon which aircraft you are on, your speed adjustment limitations are there. The Canberra type of aircraft, which I flew subsequently, had ample range of speed. So you could reduce the speed as low as about 300 knots and increase your speed as high as 450 knots. Therefore, it was a large range of speed, so you could adjust your timing very well.
And you could meet your time over target.
You can meet your time over target.
Right. And what would you do in cloudy weather, so where you weren't able to get a quick...
Yeah, mostly radio navigation aids facilities are available, like bearings on the VORs, and plot the bearings and get the fixes.
But over enemy territory, you wouldn't have that, isn't it? So what would you do?
Yeah, you wouldn't have that. So I haven't talked about another very important aid which Canberra's had in those days. Was a Doppler. Doppler is a very excellent aid. It is based on the principles of aircraft sending the radio waves, and the ground returning those waves. When you send such waves in succession, you get Doppler effect. Doppler effect is the one that is, if you're traveling towards a point and the radio navigation waves, what you receive back, the frequency appear to have changed. If you're going towards an object, frequency increases. If you're going away from the object, frequency decreases. So using that basic principle and converting that into the range, the Doppler is worked out. I mean, the distance is worked out, and you can get your instant ground speed with that.
And drift also?
Which is a great innovation in all other aids. And if you put in a computer type of mechanism like a position indicator, which I said some time back, and if that is employed with the Doppler, then it is called ground position indicator. So it directly gives you ground position if you set the datum or zero position at a known point. like starting your airport.
Right.
And thereafter, you get virtually ground position, which is extremely accurate.
Uh-huh.
And you keep updating that. That means any errors, etc., correcting by
Some visual
your other
landmarks.
observations.
Okay.
And thereafter, updating that so you have very updated ground plot, which is mechanical ground plot. So you don't have to use charts. You just plot the position. That's it. And you can directly plot on the map as well.
Was there any risk that this Doppler signal could be picked up by the enemy and they'd know you were coming?
Yes, that risk was there. So what was the solution we found in those days? Was don't use Doppler all along.
Uh-huh.
Use it in pulses.
Okay. Uh-huh.
And that is how actually another Doppler was designed, known as pulse Doppler.
Uh-huh.
That means what we used to do manually, the same thing the equipment will do automatically.
Uh-huh. Okay.
It will send pulses periodically for a very short burst,
Okay.
which even if picked up by enemy, they won't be able to sort of decode that and
Right.
follow it up that the aeroplane is coming from this side. Which is very hard if you are using pulse Doppler.
Right. So, sorry, sir, we've been jumping around, but now that we've got the theory out of the way, I'd just love to hear your experiences flying in a Dakota as the navigator on the flight. And, I'm sure in some of the areas of the Northeast and all that, it's quite difficult to navigate, and the narrow valleys and things like that. So, what are some of your experiences there?
Yes, certainly. As I mentioned, that I was first posted to Agra in a strategic reconnaissance squadron, which had two flights. One was Dakota flight, other was Canberra flight. So I was initially posted to the Dakota flight, and interesting experience in that I'll just narrate a couple of them. And that was the 1965 operation was not too far from my posting there, within a matter of year and a half. And we had become fully operational by them on Dakotas. And one of the fascinating experiences what we had, perhaps you know that iconic photograph which picked up the Pakistani tanks in the run of Kutch. Taken by the Dakotas in those days.
Right, wow.
There's not much of publication, but that was it. And that's how we came to know in the month of April 1965 that Pakistani forces have really sort of attacked our positions in the run of Kutch. Give you a little bit of a run of Kutch. Why is it called run? Because 4 months in a year, there is monsoon months from June to September. This run gets flooded with seawater and the entire area becomes marshy. Of course, there are some high grounds where villages are there, but they communicate among themselves by small boats during that time.
Wow.
And they're quite used to that run getting flooded with seawater. Sometimes that seawater is so shallow that their animals can walk through that. Like these villagers use camels and wild donkeys. Wild donkey is a very popular animal in that part.
Right.
And rest of the 8 months, the run is absolutely dry like a desert. Of course, there is some vegetation there, not that totally out of vegetation. And like the snow-clad mountains were considered as not a blade of grass grows there, etc. Similarly, the run was considered as nothing happens there. Why do you need that land?
Right.
And with that attitude, unfortunately, after 65 war, there was a dispute about Pakistan claimed some territory. And like fools, Indians agreed for a tribunal where the British Prime Minister, then Harold Wilson, was the chairman of that tribunal. And that tribunal took 10 years. He was kicked out as a Prime Minister, but he remained the chairman of the tribunal. Pakistan had claimed 9,000 square kilometers land, and Wilson awarded them 350 square kilometers of land of Kutch, run of Kutch. And India, like fools again, handed over that part. And perhaps many of us don't know, there was a large airfield on that 350 square miles of land. And that is right on the border of Iran and Pakistan. That is Sindh province of Pakistan. And that is now in the hands of Pakistan. So what a foolish thing we have done by agreeing to that tribunal first and handing over that airfield on the platter to the enemy.
Right.
Anyway, another thing I wanted to tell you from the Dakota days, that during 65 war, actually, they developed a technique known as oblique photography. That means the aeroplane will fly in our own territory and photograph the enemy targets in enemy territory. But that will be at an angle.
Right.
So to read that photograph, you got to take a vertical photograph as well to correlate. And the resolution of that oblique photograph wasn't very good, but at least it gave you a visual picture of the target. And that oblique photography became very popular, especially for the tactical targets. And there was tremendous demand of the such photographs. Of course, 65, the war wasn't for too long. It got cut short, and thereafter that technique was perhaps used very rarely thereafter.
Right.
But that was another experience. But another drawback what Dakotas had, because the cabin of Dakotas was not pressurized.
Right.
As a result, the temperature used to be very low in the cabin.
Wow.
Cockpit had the heaters, but cabin didn't have. So poor navigator who used to operate the camera from the cabin had to put on the electrically heated suits.
Oh boy.
Arm himself with the electrically heating. So that was a very arduous task.
My goodness.
Until Avro, the HS748 was modified and then that was deployed. I mean, the aircraft was replaced in 106. So that was the history of that. So, but in my case, what happened, that experience of Dakotas was carried forward. Benegal was the commanding officer, and he sent me to Canberra conversion across the tarmac to JBCU, Jet Bomber Conversion Unit, with the understanding that I'll be posted back to the same strategist squadron. And that's what happened in 1966. I did conversion and came back in the Canberra flight. And that's how my career started in Canberra reconnaissance.
Okay. And this was when you all were doing the mapping of the borders and mapping of the country and things like that?
Yeah, you know a lot about it.
No, Vinko, Tommy has spoken about it, but I'd love to hear from your side what are some of the activities and challenges that you had.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Canberra aircraft was originally designed for high altitude bombing and reconnaissance. That was in 1957. In fact, this design was originally from World War II, and India bought these aircraft in 1957. Unfortunately, what happened by then, that technique of high level bombing and reconnaissance became outdated.
Right.
Why? Because of advent of surface-to-air missiles and night capability of fighters.
Right.
During Second World War, very few fighters had night capabilities. That's why they were called night fighters. However, that capability was enhanced post-Second World War. And many aircraft became the night qualified, or they could have the night capability of intercepting the enemy aircraft. And another major threat was the surface-to-air missiles. Surface-to-air missiles could be launched with very high speed, which is more than 2 Mach. And therefore, Canberras at high altitude became vulnerable to both these. Therefore, these techniques became outdated. And Canberras had to design something different to do both the roles, that is bombing as well as a
photo reconnaissance.
For reconnaissance, Canberras were equipped with imagery, that is various types of cameras. There were one prime vertical camera and about 6 of them were the large-scale photographic cameras of something known as focal length of about 36 inches. So that gave great resolutions. But these cameras were at an angle, and all 6 cameras, whatever they could cover, was covered in one plate of the vertical camera.
Wow.
So you had to read these photos with combination of the vertical plate as well as the oblique cameras, which are at a very small angle. But the advantage was they would give excellent resolution. And the photo interpreters are the ones which read those photographs must get one feature on minimum 3 photos. Advantage of that is they would use the stereoscope and get a three-dimensional picture.
Okay.
So that was a technique. Now, to get such type of photographs of a target, if the high-level technique is out, what do? First of all, you got to reach over the target in any case.
Right.
So that you can't avoid. So perhaps what a technique what we developed was reduce the time over target to minimum. Select a height which is above the anti-aircraft guns range. Why reduce the time to minimum? Because surface-to-air missiles had a reaction time.
Right.
That means moment a radar tells them that there is a bogey or enemy aircraft at so-and-so point, SAM takes a while to activate itself and launch it. And our intelligence told us that SAM's reaction time was something like 4 minutes. So we developed a technique that we had to fit in that our exposure to the radars less than 4 minutes. So what we developed something known as Popup Technique. Go close to the target, pull up to the height which is above the ACAT, but for comfortable photography or imagery, and minimum exposure to the SAM. So technique was 1 minute to climb or pop up, 2 minutes over the target, and 1 minute to go down to deck level.
Wow.
So within 4 minutes, you are back to the closer to the ground.
My God.
And thereafter, in our language, belt at the speed of 450 knots.
Right.
Because it's the SAM, if it is launched, by the time it catches you, it has to have acceleration time.
Right.
So if you are belting at 450 knots, that is your airspeed. Ground speed will always be a little higher than that. And you could be able to get away from SAM. But still, if a SAM catches you, what do? Then, Jack Robinson, you have got nothing to do. You have got no defenses.
Right.
Because at such technique, there's hardly any fighter could give you cover. Because this type of odd technique, no fighters were able to
accompany.
cope up with these cameras. But we had developed another emergency technique at the time of last movement if SAM really is launched. And that radar has to tell you. If radar tells you that SAM is launched, then at that 450 knots of deck level flying, you do barrel rolls.
Wow.
What is the advantage of barrel roll? SAM will go through the barrel because SAM is faster than aircraft. And if the bogey aircraft is doing a barrel roll, SAM cannot do barrel roll, and SAM has to penetrate that, and it will go to the center of the barrel.
Wow.
And the aircraft will be safe. That was in theory, because in my remembrance, not a single aircraft had a SAM launched on it.
Right.
So we were safe until then.
Wow.
The same thing was for the night fighters. If the fighters are launched, fighter speed is not as high as that of SAM. Like F-104 or F-5 had speed little more than a Mach. So they could go roughly about 1.5 Mach.
Right.
And 1.5 Mach acceleration time and catching up with the aircraft takes a little longer. And that much time was adequate for you to get away. Incidentally, some of our aircraft were, enemy aircraft tried to intercept them, but they managed to get away. There was not a single casualty in my memory. But they've said some fighters scrambled at our aircraft.
Right.
And there was another type of technique we had to modify, that is penetrating the enemy territory. With high level was totally impossible. Therefore, you had to penetrate the enemy territory at low level.
Right.
And remain below the radar coverage. And remaining below radar coverage was something like between 300 and 500 feet above ground.
Wow.
And that was the difficult part. And if you had to do night, then the technique changes because you got to drop flares to light the target.
Wow.
And dropping flare means you have to make minimum 2 runs. Or one aircraft drops flares, the other aircraft does photography.
Okay.
So that was a technique employed sometimes, but that was a very dangerous one.
Right.
Therefore, that was used not very popularly. So therefore, these were the challenges. So let me come to the other type of work what they did,
Right.
which is also pretty interesting. One was photographing the Mcmahon Line.
Right.
Now, Mcmahon Line, as you know, is the line of our border between the then Northeast Frontier Agency, NIFA, now known as Arunachal Pradesh, and Tibet.
Yeah.
Now, that Mcmahon Line was finalized in 1914 by the great surveyor whose last name was Mcmahon.
Right.
His name is given to that line.
Yeah.
Now, he used the technique of ground surveys in those days. Now, our government wanted to ascertain the correct border of correct Mcmahon Line. And the major handicap was that the ground surveys did not really give you the correct highest watershed. Highest watershed is the principle of fixing a border in hilly terrain.
Right.
All over the world. Now, there the terrain is so complicated between the Arunachal Pradesh and Tibet that two ridges close to each other may appear almost at same height. So which is the highest among the 2 or 3 or 4 such ridges? Now that can be ascertained only by aerial imagery. And no other technique at that time was available. Therefore, the task was given to ask Gordon to photograph the Mcmahon Line. A Mcmahon Line runs too far right from Bhutan on the west to a trijunction of India, Burma, and Tibet border.
Right.
In the east, near a peak known as Namcha Barwa, which was in those days unclaimed peak. No mountaineer has ever climbed that peak in those days.
Wow.
Subsequently, it was climbed by some Chinese mountaineers. It falls in Tibet. So that Mcmahon Line was to be photographed, and Chinese have just started getting the fighter capability in those days. So there was no playing ground for us. We had to look for gaps between Chinese activities. So our radars used to warn us that they used to assess actually. They had long steady. I mean, those chaps, I'm hats off to them, the amount of work what they did. They gave us the approximate gaps. And we used to fly over the Mcmahon Line around those gaps. Still, radars used to keep watch and warn us if any Chinese aircraft is scrambled. We used to run back.
My goodness. And you were operating out of Tezpur, is it?
Absolutely, operating out of Tezpur and Jorat. Jorat for the eastern sector, Tezpur for the western sector.
Wow.
And it was fascinating work. As some of you may know that being easternmost part, the sun rises very early there, around 4 o'clock in the morning, and sets also very early, about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So our day used to start very early. So we used to try to catch little after sunrise, and thereafter we had to wait for we could have the time until Chinese woke up. And the moment we get a call from our SUs, we'll run back. So that's why the work was done in bits and pieces. And another marvelous thing that close working with that of army guys who were actually plotting those process photographs and how the Mcmahon Line works, it looks like, etc. That was also on the spot there, wherever we were based. And a usual routine used to be, after you get back, go have your lunch, have a bit of nap, and go down, head towards that platoon known as GASLP, Ground Air Survey Liaison Platoon.
Okay.
So everybody knew that as a GASLP. And interestingly, those Jawans who were working in that were so clueful that moment they see a photograph, they would detect, oh, this is not a pure vertical photograph. You had a bit of angle of bank there. I mean, we are taken aback. How do you know that? But they're so experienced interpreters
Wow.
that this is how teamwork is done. It's not only between the crew of the aircraft, it's also among other support staff. And then they used to cross-check the features with us, and we used to talk a lot about it. I mean, the sessions used to be with the GSLP guys for a few hours every day. Another interesting type of project what we had was the mapping of entire country. Now, what has happened is all the maps actually are produced by the Surveyor General of India.
Right.
And most of them are done by the ground surveys, and they're fairly accurate. You see these guys running around with theodolite,
Yes.
and with that big staff using all the figures on them and taking angles and recording them. Very arduous tasks they do. Now, those surveys had to be corroborated, and corroboration happens with no other better means than aerial imagery.
Right.
Therefore, we were tasked to do the photography of the entire country at a very small scale for us, but fairly large in compared to those maps. Because the maps mostly were produced on the 1:1 million scale. And some army maps used to be produced at 1:2 quarter million scale.
Right.
The earlier name was the quarter-inch maps. Subsequently, when the metric system came, they became quarter million scale.
Right.
They're very close to each other, not too far. So a million map, they were very popular in aviation. All the aviators use million maps, but all the army guys use either quarter-inch map or the quarter million map or 1-inch map. 1-inch map is even larger than that.
Right.
So all the tactical planning is done on the 1-inch map. So they needed to be updated. And for that, the Surveyor General required the photography at the scale of 1:30,000. 1:30,000 is somewhat closer to quarter million.
Quarter million, yeah.
But it will also suffice for 1-inch maps. Wherever they required better resolution, we used to give it the photography at 1:15,000 as well. But for that, aircraft had to do more runs.
Okay.
And Canberra was ideally suited airplanes to do these runs. And generally, wind being easterly or westerly, we used to do the photo runs east-west. And imagine an airplane starts at the east coast of India, lands at the west coast. And another one starting from west goes to the east coast.
And you would do this while operating out of Agra. So you would get airborne from Agra?
No, we had to go and operate out of the various airfields which were closer.
Okay.
So wherever our area of operation was, we used to go and operate from there.
Okay.
So we had these mini detachments. Mini detachment means 1 or 2 aircraft with the support staff will go and land up at place X and start operating from there. And we were so self-sufficient that we didn't really need any services other than the airport to land and mess to sleep.
Okay.
So we didn't really, because we were having everything else portably with us.
Roger, report time southeast, connection for the midway, and field selected.
So I've taken more than an hour of your time. Maybe we can change gears to accident investigation. How did you get involved with that?
Oh, that is a long story. All right, I'll go on to this a bit quickly. We may not be able to cover the rest of the things. Perhaps you may have to have another session. But quickly, I'll just run through what other projects were did. Was the weather research along with Britain. British had sent their PR-9 aircraft, which is advanced than our PR-7 aircraft. So with the British Royal Air Force PR9, we did weather research and penetrating the cumulonimbus clouds, which are the dangerous clouds of flying
Wow.
at high altitude, and doing a lot of research on that. So that project was going on for one monsoon in 1967. We enjoyed that. One of our aircraft was deputized, Rahul Bal and myself were deputized on that.
My goodness. So that's like the C-130, which goes inside the hurricanes nowadays.
That's correct. That's another aircraft was there, but I purposely said because PR9 had a lot of imagery equipment on that which could do better study than C-130. Then there was a fresh runway built in Karnakuba, one of the islands south of Nicobar Island, in 1968. An army group of engineers had built that airfield, and Jagannath and myself, we were deputized to do the inaugural flight of Canberra there. Because the heavy aircraft they could send to that airfield, which is 2 hours flying away for our time from Calcutta or Madras.
Uh-huh.
And before that, there was a lot of preparatory work was needed. That is, study the airport construction, as we call it LCN, landing classification number, aircraft classification number, payment classification, and so on and so forth. So Jagannath and myself had camped engineering chief's office for about a month to do all that study. And we became airport construction experts within that 1 month before we actually did that inaugural flight. So it was a very interesting project.
Fascinating.
Then there was a requirement of instructors into the Air India or Indian Airlines in those days, and I was deputized to go there. So I did 1 year's deputation and finally changed over to Air India.
Right.
Worked in Air India for 10 years, wherein I had the opportunity to get training onto the Boeing 737 and A320. And that training was conducted in both their alma maters in Toulouse in France for A320 and Seattle in USA for Boeing 737.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
And that time I was also trained into accident investigation at both the institutions, one for the US, that is at their NTSB's school, that is Accident Investigation School at Oklahoma, National Transportation Safety Board School it is, and other is in France. Very longish French name, so I won't bother you with that French name. It is known as BAE, which is an investigation agency of France, which is a civilian agency, and they had a school in nearby Paris, so I was trained there.
And had you done any accident investigation when you were in the Air Force, sir, or this was your first exposure to
In fact, I must give you a very classic experience from that NTSB school. When I landed up there and for a course, there were about 20 of my colleagues in the same classroom. So that course was very intense. And the very first day, retired Sergeant Major walked in to the classroom, introduced himself as I am retired Sergeant Major of so-and-so, and I did investigation work for 30 years. That was his credentials. And all of us were officers from different areas. So generally with our background, we said, all right, Sergeant Major can have his own time. And he gave us a question paper to start with just 10 questions. Oh, we thought Sergeant Major means business. So all of us attempted that question paper. And we thought that they will collect the question papers and, answer book sheets and mark it. But surprisingly, Sergeant Major said, no, keep the answer books with you. I'm going to flash the right answers on the board and you'll correct your papers yourself. So all of us did that. each one virtually about 20 years of experience in various types of accident investigations. Mine was mainly from the Air Force and bit from the civil as well. And then Sergeant Major started his game. He said, those of you who have all 10 questions correct, raise your hands. No one. So he came down one by one up to 5 questions. One hand came up. And rest were less than 5 correct. And he just said one sentence thereafter. That is why we need this type of courses. And he walked out.
What a powerful technique.
Anyway, that was very interesting, and we learned a lot in that course. In spite of doing so many years of investigation, we really learned the real bits, how the investigators should go about. And that came very handy in my first investigation, international investigation of that Airbus 320 in Bahrain, which I did as an investigator in charge, that is the person in charge. It so happened on the 23rd of August, year 2000, an Airbus 320 had started from Cairo with crew and passengers, 143 souls on board, coming to Bahrain. 3.5 hours of flight. Everything was hunky-dory until he made an approach at Bahrain at dusk time. And it so happened that he wasn't positioned well for the landing. He was at a very awkward angle to the runway. Therefore, rather than doing standard procedure of going around and doing another racecourse circuit and coming in for landing or using ILS or any other equipment, what he did it 360, real Air Force style.
Right.
Although he was not Air Force man, but he did a 360. And the beauty of 360 is, normally after 360, you land up at the same place with the same angle of aircraft. So when he completed 360, his position in relation to runway wasn't very much different than what it was before. So he could make a landing on that approach as well. Now he decided to go around with the standard procedure of go around, do racecourse pattern of your circuit, and come back for landing. But unfortunately, what happened? When he was going around, he had to climb usual pattern from the circuit, from the almost landing height. He used to go to at least circuit altitude, which is 1,500 feet above the ground. And that direction was towards sea. Bahrain is an island, and runway is very close to the shore of the island. So thereafter, once you take off and land, everything was sea. Therefore, he had nothing but sea ahead of him. And it was dusk time, sun had set, twilight has disappeared, and he was looking in total dark. Now you imagine, not even as a pilot, even as a layman, who's going into the dark, he has got no references, and aircraft is climbing at a sharp angle because you go around with full power.
Going around at full power.
And you started off with almost the ground level or the airport level, which is at almost sea level there. 6 feet is the height of the Bahrain runway from mean sea level. And going to 1,500 feet of height. What happens? There is a natural phenomena known as cinematographic illusion.
Right.
It's a very technical word. Leave aside the word. What it actually happens, the aircraft, though it is climbing, for a pilot it appears that it is descending. And he tried to correct that. And as a result, and vice versa. So if the aircraft is descending, it appears he's climbing. So what he did first, he leveled out and he started descending. Now, he initiated a descent around 1,000 feet. And Thereafter, he had a feeling, the cinematographic illusion, that he is climbing. Whereas he was actually descending and he increased his descent. Now, this is the illusion what took him out, and he went into the sea at a very high speed.
Right.
You'll be surprised, 256 knots was the impact speed when he entered the sea.
Mm-hmm.
There is your speed on the circuit, which is around 120 to 150 knots. And where is the speed? 256 knots. So the ASI indicated 256 knots on the impact. And all 143 souls on board perished. Anyway, that's what the story of the accident. Now, what happened? That was a major accident in Bahrain for the first time. They never had an accident of this scale. So everyone was shaken up. The Civil Aviation Department was fully shaken up. It was headed by Undersecretary of Civil Aviation, and I used to work under him as a Director of Air Safety. So by default, the task of investigation fell on me, and Undersecretary asked me, we have to get the team for investigation. How soon can you get the investigators? I was totally taken aback. Fortunately, I had my contacts, so I told him just a ballpark figure to give me 24 hours. So he had to report to the Minister of Transportation. So he reported to Minister of Transportation that my Director of Safety is going to get investigators in 24 hours.
Right.
Right in front of me. So I had no choice, but I was committed. So I turned to the telephones and to my counterparts in different countries, and they responded. And tell you the beauty of it, that was the effect of our course at Oklahoma and Paris, wherein those guys knew the urgency and they landed up in Bahrain virtually within 24 hours. I had a team of about 50 investigators. Americans, French, British, Australians, Egyptians, and you name it.
Right.
And interestingly, that night, almost around midnight, I introduced the team to the Minister of Transportation with each one's first name. Minister of Transportation was taken aback, Sheikh Ali, who had studied in Pune University. So he knows Hindi very well. So he asked me, Aapne kaisa jana? How do you know their first names? So I told him, sir, I've worked with them. And thereafter the bond was built, and we really employed the techniques, not only what was taught to us, but we have practiced. First 48 hours after an accident are extremely crucial. Whatever evidence you get during that first 48 hours. And unfortunately, many of the investigations world over do not follow that golden rule. Anyway, so another interesting part of that investigation was Gulf Air was the God's own airline. So they were registered in Oman. So Bahrain really didn't have much to do with that airline. Although it was based in Bahrain, they used to use traffic lights of Bahrain. But who used to control them, the operational maintenance control, etc., was Oman from Muscat.
Right.
Although Bahrain was the state of occurrence, so investigation responsibility always rests with the state of occurrence. Other important state was Oman, which was state of registry and state of operator. Another important state was Egypt, because it was a state of people who departure and people who died in that accident. They were about 35 Egyptians on board, and about 60 Bahrainis and rest other nationalities. About 30 nationalities.
There was an Indian crew member I saw.
Not Indian. Crew members were Omani and...
one of the cabin crew, I think, was...
No, cabin crew were Indians. Yes, some of them. There were 6 cabin crew, 2 pilots, and one pilot was Omani and other pilot was Bahraini. And
of course, the French were interested because of Airbus.
French were because it was a French aircraft, Airbus 320. So French was also involved. And what was the role of NTSB or the US authorities? We invited them. And mind you, on our invitation, they sent their deputy administrator, which is number 2 in their entire setup of NTSB. Frank Hildrup, his name. He had worked with me in Oklahoma there. And Frank was very useful along with his team. Incidentally, there were some girls in his team. And so Arab State was a bit skeptical how girl investigators are doing here. So I had to pacify them. They had full confidence in me, so they really bore with us. And these girls did fantastic job. One of them was airworthiness expert, and other was air traffic expert. And first thing we started was the rescue and search and rescue phase, followed by interviews of all the persons involved. And within a matter of 3 days, with the help of BAE or the French authorities, we created an animation of the last 4.5 minutes of the accident. Now, I was telling you about Gulf Air being God's own airline. They didn't care for the Omani authorities. Sorry, that was not to be reported onto the investigation, but we knew about it. Well, everybody knew about it. As a result, in fact, the Director General of Oman, in one of the sessions, told us point blank, I told Gulf Air many times they didn't bother. That was his statement. So that was the situation. So they started giving press releases that Gulf Air is a fantastic airline and we did everything right and nothing wrong with this aircraft, nothing wrong with the crew. There may be something technically wrong, etc., etc. That was premature reporting. So they were called up by the minister and given a peace of mind that don't do any such things. And it so happened that I had the presentation to be given. So what used to happen that the investigation team used to meet twice a day. To first time in the morning, that about 9 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the evening. First time to give instructions what everybody has to do, and second time to get back the reports from each one. So that was the usual pattern.
Right.
So on the third day, there was a first morning meeting, and I had invited the minister to attend that meeting and told him that I'm going to present the animation there. And so he called that chief executive of Gulf Air as well. I had no direct connection with him. So he also landed up in that meeting. And I presented that animation on the screen just about 4.5 minutes. That actually showed an aeroplane. I described you the first time how the pilot did the various activities. Initial approach, not placed well with the runway, 360, again not placed well with the runway, and trying to climb, to go around, etc., etc. And along with that animation of the aircraft, we could present from the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder 2 things. One is the aircraft heading and speed displayed on the board, on the screen, and the conversation what captain is telling the co-pilot and what co-pilot is telling the captain. Conversation of this in the type form or transcription. On the board, everybody can read that. So you don't have to really ask any questions. You have the entire scenario of accident in front of you.
Right.
Why accident has happened. So after giving initial introduction, I didn't have to speak a word. Moment the animation started, everybody knew what's happening, and simultaneously the audio was also played, wherein we could hear all the calls from captain to co-pilot, co-pilot to ATC, ATC back to aircraft, and so on for last 4.5 minutes. So you had the entire picture in front of you, as if you are watching an accident sitting in the space.
Right.
At the end of that animation, when I switched it off, and like a courtesy, I said, has anybody got any questions? So the chief executive of the Gulf Air, he was from royal family of Abu Dhabi. So as far as Arabs are concerned, very big man. He politely said thank you and requested the minister if he could meet with him separately. The minister, undersecretary, and the chief executive of Gulf Air walked out from there. And minister told me while going, because he was the chief guest there, that you continue with your work and thank you for your presentation. And the 3 of them walked out. We carried out our business for next another half an hour and dispersed. And I had a message that I should report to the minister. When I went there, he told me the chief executive of Gulf Air has resigned.
Oh my God.
I mean, he accepted the responsibility. He apologized profusely, stating that it was wrong on my part to give the press conference and the fault is totally with the Gulf Air. I mean, it's very honorable gesture on his part. Being from a royal families, it works both ways. I've seen some of the royals are very, very gracious, like this fellow, although he may be arrogant in his normal life. But while doing that, he was very gracious, I should say, and so on.
Right.
And the second incident about this accident was when I concluded that investigation later on, after some time, and the final report was given, there were 32 recommendations and not a single dissenting voice because they were accredited representative from all these states which I initially mentioned, including that of Oman. And when that report was presented to Oman authorities, the Director General of Oman Civil Aviation Authority resigned. He accepted his part of the blame as well.
Right.
Although he said that Gulf Air didn't listen to him or his advice, it was still his duty. He should have resigned at that time. Basically, my point in making this is, there's nothing wrong with any person conducting an inquiry. But if you want the truth to come out, and if you want corrective actions to happen, you got to give that authority to the investigating people.
Right.
Unless that comes, you won't get that. Now, let me give you what happened in Gulf Air or the entire Middle East. Gulf Air was totally revamped. They underwent restructuring. And 21 years since, you haven't heard of any accidents in that part. Within those 4 countries, Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Roger, report time southeast, connection, for Midway, field selected.
I don't know whether I have time to describe the second accident that is in Germany.
Yeah, maybe I'll give the audience a link to the report because again, that's a very fascinating accident where the TCAS, gave a different instruction compared to the controller. But so I want to ask you a question as a pilot myself. A lot of pilots feel like in an accident investigation, particularly where there is a fatality involving the crew, that somehow the pilots are blamed and the pilots don't have a chance to defend themselves because they're not there. How would you respond to people who say that? Because I've heard it quite commonly said among the pilot fraternity.
Oh, very interesting question. And I really congratulate you for asking that question. I did come across this question many times before, and response to that is very simple. When we conduct the investigation as per the ICAO guidelines, the exercise is not to blame anyone, but to find out
Right.
what has gone wrong during the accident and what can we do to see that the similar occurrence doesn't happen. So that is the mandate. Now coming back to the actual occurrence, wherein we don't say that who is to blame or who did what wrong. What we say there is there are 2 types of factors. So we use a very neutral word known as factor, in which the human factors, the technical factors, etc. But all of them are further subdivided into something known as systemic factors. What is a systemic factor? Is a factor because of the system. Because system functions in a particular manner. Going back to this Gulf Air accident, I'll narrate one part and point out why it is attributed to system. Gulf Air had one order for pilots well before the accident occurred, that in case any pilot does go around, he has to file a report after landing to the flight dispatch. Flight dispatch is like our operations office. That was a very simple 2-word order. Now see the effects of that.
Yeah. Now they want to avoid the paperwork, so they want to avoid going around.
Not only paperwork, they want to avoid being questioned by the operations manager. Because the moment that report goes to operations manager, who's the boss, like that of our flight commander, he would question that pilot, why did you go around? No, he has to explain that. Therefore, it will discourage anybody going around. Whereas, teaching in the pilot syllabus is not only you are uncomfortable on the final approach, you have deviated more than the norms. Like that, for example, your heading is out more than 5 degrees. Your speed is out more than 5 knots. So these are the norms. Your height is out more than few hundred feet.
2-dot deviation on the ILS.
You go around. That is the teaching. Now, whereas this particular aircraft was way away from those norms. And another part is the first officer or co-pilot did not tell the captain that you have deviated, because those calls were in front of everyone. You could hear the CVR, cockpit voice recorders recording, and that co-pilot was silent. Now, interestingly, I did a presentation in Delhi in front of Indian pilots sometime in after this accident, of maybe after 5 years or so. And this accident was discussed there. The group of pilots were mostly civil pilots, not the Air Force, from various airlines, and they were a combination of captains and co-pilots. So after narrating this particular accident, I put a question to the audience that how many of co-pilots here, in the presence of that type of situation which we described just now for this accident, would insist upon captain to correct his anomalies when his parameters are deviated from the normal by so much difference. So there were some about 10 odd hands came up. There were about 50 odd co-pilots there. Then I asked the captains, how many of the captains would appreciate the co-pilot insisting that they should fly the appropriate parameters? I've taken a step further. Normally in teaching, there are 3 stages. In the first stage, the co-pilot points out. In the second stage, the co-pilot insists. You come back to the norms, otherwise go around. And in the third stage, which is very rare in our part of the world, that co-pilot tells the captain that, sir, unless you go back to the norms, I will take over the controls. Right. So, and this teaching is everywhere. Everybody knows about it. India is also same teaching is there. But actually, it doesn't happen. So when I asked that question, just about 2 hands came up out of 50 captains. And there were what we say, having worked in the international field, it is the authority gradient between the captain and the first officer. Unfortunately, which is very, very steep in the eastern part of the world. It is as steep as in India as in Korea. Equally steep in Japan. In Japan, the captain is held in virtually highest esteem next to God. And therefore, this teaching doesn't work. That is what is the message which this particular accident investigation gave. And there are a number of training modules work out on this for the simulator training, wherein pilots are taught, particularly co-pilots and captains, that any deviations more than XYZ, co-pilot has to point out. Second stage, co-pilot has to insist. And third stage, he has to say that unless captain comes back to those parameters, he will take over the controls. And this is taught on the simulators all over the world. I'm not very sure that it happens in our country. Anyway, that's a different issue. But the point is, this is a systemic factor.
Yeah, that's right.
I will not blame that co-pilot for not doing it. I will not blame that captain for not doing it, not accepting it. I will blame the system. And that is what is the beauty of this type of investigation, where systemic factors are pointed out. And I wanted to highlight in that other accident where TCAS thing is there, where that accident happens because of the systemic factors. It was not a fault of the air traffic controller. Neither it was a fault of the instructor on board TU-154, who was the captain at that time.
Chief pilot.
Yeah. And therefore, it was a systemic fact. And you must fix the system. And that's what Gulf Air did. And that's what I wanted to point it out to you, that the aftermath of that Juberlingen accident or the Lake Constance accident was that the Eurocontrol had accepted the responsibility And you'll be surprised that the payouts of insurance went out of Eurocontrol for everybody's insurance. It was very gracious of Eurocontrol, but that happened after our investigation report came out. And not only that, the entire system was revamped. That is why I sent you the report of the review report. So in review report, they not only accept the responsibility, lay down how the corrections will be done. And again, the example is that accident happened in year 2002. In last 19 years, that airspace is virtually free of any major accidents.
Wow. Right.
Not only Eurocontrol did that, every country in the European airspace did implemented those recommendations, because we received the report at ICAO of those countries implementing the reports.
No, actually, that is one thing about the aviation industry, is how by the systematic process of analysis and then fixing of all systemic failures, the accident rates now are just minuscule to where, this is truly the safest human act.
That's right. And we try to sort of, refine it more and more. And I can give my comment on that airworthiness is step ahead of flight operations. They have really put in very, very hard work to put the system straight. Whereas in flight operations, it is yet to catch up with the rate at which airworthiness has done.
Right.
Because if you see the follow-up, the airworthiness directives and the implementation of them, and the insistence of following them, implementing the airworthiness directive, grounding the fleets for not implementing the airworthiness directives is a very, very stiff. You hear sometimes that FAA has grounded so many aircraft because of non-implementation of the airworthiness directive or deviating with the airworthiness directives. So you have to have such strong authorities to take this type of action, which is felt by the operators or users, so that they do not make systemic errors. And the first time using this word error, because we stopped using this error for many, many years back.
Right.
But when it is deliberately done, we term it as error. And many of the operators, many a times, do such deliberate actions, and which is evident, been seen whenever you start doing investigation. Within a matter of minutes, you come to know who has done something deliberately.
Right. Wonderful. I can't thank you enough. This has been such a long and wonderful discussion, but we've only scratched the surface of all your wealth of experience. Thank you so much for speaking to me, sir. It has really been a pleasure.
No, thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. Okay.
Visual before major line. Just 70, Roger, report back southeast, connection, for the midway, and field selected.
Well, folks, that's all we have time for this week. Join us again next week. In the meantime, sign up for updates at blueskiespodcast.com. There you'll find links to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can also write to us with your comments, questions, suggestions, and feedback from the website or to blueskies@prganapati.com. Subscribe to the podcast on any podcasting platform such as Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and even on YouTube. If you like what you heard, share it with your friends, give us a rating in your favorite podcasting app, and write us a review. It will help other people find us. I want to give my thanks to Saurav Chordia for our logo and Prithvik for the music. I want to reiterate that all the views expressed here are personal, and this podcast has not been approved by or reviewed by the Air Force, Ministry of Defense, or any branch of the government. In the meantime, stay safe and Jai Hind.